Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Great Pacific War by Hector C. Bywater. Chapter 6, March to April, 1931.
For nearly a fortnight after the bomb attack of March 4th, which had destroyed the radio station at Maginao, Guam was left undisturbed. Japanese aircraft from Saipan occasionally flew over the island, but without dropping bombs. No attempt was made to engage them, for there were only 8 American machines in Guam, and the governor had determined to hold these in reserve to meet an emergency. On the morning of March 18th, the lookout station on Aludum reported smoke on the southern horizon, whereupon a plane was sent up to scout. The newcomers proved to be the destroyers Dent, Lamberton, and Rizal, the last named fitted as a mine layer, which had broken out from Manila Bay before the capitulation. When still some 10 miles west of Orote Point, the flotilla was observed to be zigzagging, putting on speed, and making a smoke screen. A few minutes later, the leading boat opened fire, and depth charges began to explode. It was evident to the watchers ashore that a hostile submarine was attempting to attack, but if so, it seemed to have failed, for the 3 boats came on at high speed. Then, just as the second boat in the line, the Dent, was drawing abreast of Orote Point, a column of water shot up from her starboard side, followed by the dull boom of an explosion. A torpedo, striking amidships, had broken her back, causing her to sink quickly, while 2 more torpedoes from the unseen enemy narrowly missed the Rizal. When this vessel and the Lamberton reached their moorings off Cabras Island, their commanders at once came ashore to report to the governor, Captain Harper, USN, who now heard for the first time the tragic tidings from the Philippines. Manila was still holding out when the destroyers left, but it was known then that surrender was only a matter of days, if not hours. That Guam would be attacked in its turn at any moment was patent to all, and with such scanty means of defense as it possessed, there seemed little hope of making an effective resistance. The submarines which had left Manila at the same time as the destroyers had not yet arrived, nor with their low speed were they likely to reach Ypres for 2 or 3 days. At 1 p.m. on March 18th, the lookout station on Aludum again reported smoke on the horizon, this time to the westward, and again an airplane went up to reconnoiter. 2 large steamers of cargo build were found to be heading for Ypres, and were soon identified as the naval transports Newport News and Beaufort, which had left San Francisco in February bound for Manila, with a consignment of artillery, mines, and other war material. As the Beaufort's speed was not above 8 knots and the 2 ships kept together, their voyage had been a long one. On March 9th, when still 700 miles to the east of the Philippines, they met a German steamer, which gave them news of the destruction of the American squadron off Manila. This intelligence decided them to retrace their course, since by continuing on to the Philippines, they would almost certainly fall into enemy hands. Their intention was to return to Honolulu, but coal was running short, and at dusk on the 13th they sighted what was taken to be a Japanese submarine. This they contrived to evade, but on the following day another suspicious vessel was observed hull down to eastward. It therefore looked as if the homeward route was barred. Guam was now the only refuge within reach of the hunted ships. The Newport News, which had a long-range radio installation, repeatedly called up the island without getting any response. This silence indicated that something was amiss. It might even mean that Guam was already occupied by the Japanese. Still, there was nothing for it but to take the risk of entering a trap, for the bunkers of the 2 ships were rapidly emptying, and in a few days' time would be exhausted. So a course was shaped for the island, it having been decided that both ships should be scuttled at the first sign of danger. But no untoward incident occurred, and in the forenoon of March 18th, the coastline of Guam was sighted. Warned by the airplane which had come out to meet them that Japanese submarines were in the neighborhood, both ships began to zigzag and work up to their best speed. They were soon met by the destroyer Lamberton, which circled round them at high speed and put down a depth charge barrage. Thanks to this escort, they got safely into Ypres, where the work of discharging their valuable cargo was begun with feverish energy. By sunset on the 19th, there had been put ashore 12 7-inch and 8 6-inch guns on Caterpillar mounts with their tractors, 15 field guns, 10 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 50 heavy and light machine guns, and a large quantity of ammunition. 20 motor trucks were also landed from the Beaufort. The 7-inch weapons were of a specially powerful type. They had been removed from old battleships during the World War and adapted for land service. Each gun had a length of 25 feet and discharged a 153-pounder shell containing 24 pounds of TNT. From its Caterpillar mount, it could be fired at an elevation of 40 degrees, which gave the shell an extreme range of nearly 14 miles. With each gun was a 120-horsepower gasoline tractor, which could take it up steep hills or over the roughest open country. By reason of their great mobility and long range, these guns were ideal for coast defense against all but the heaviest warships. Had there been 2 or 3 batteries of them in the Philippines when the Japanese invasion took place, that operation might have ended differently, and would in any case have cost the enemy much heavier casualties. As lecturer at the Naval War College, Captain Harper, now governor and commandant of Guam, had gained a reputation by his ingenious if somewhat unconventional views on strategy and tactics. He was now to have an opportunity of putting certain of these theories into effect. Since being appointed to the governorship 2 years previously, he had devoted much thought to the problem of defending the island. Had batteries of heavy long-range guns been mounted at strategic points, Guam would have been almost impregnable, for the configuration of the ground lent itself admirably to artillery defense against approaching ships, and good landing places were few in number. But the building of such batteries had been neglected prior to the Washington Conference, and after that event the erection of fortifications on the island was interdicted by treaty. Failing these, mobile guns of heavy caliber would suffice, in Captain Harper's opinion, to keep hostile ships at a respectful distance. Nothing, therefore, could have been more timely or welcome than the arrival of the 2 transports with their cargo of big guns. His study of the defense problem had led him to conclude that an enemy bent on invading Guam would probably select Port Tarofofo on the east and Port Opera or Tumun Bay on the west as landing places, owing to the favorable conditions to be met with there. Alternative but less likely points of attack were Umata Bay, Agate Bay, and Agana, all on the west coast. There were not enough heavy guns to command the approach to each of these places, but there would probably be time, after the enemy had made his intentions clear, to rush several of the 7-inch tractor guns to the danger zone. Most of the Marines on the island had been trained in the use of these weapons during their service in the United States. Gun crews were hastily organized, and the guns themselves formed into batteries of 3 pieces each, with the same number of motor trucks attached to each battery for carrying the personnel and ammunition. For the field pieces and the anti-aircraft guns, teams of Carabao were provided. The weak point in the defense, and one that could not be remedied, was the shortage of airplanes. If the invading force were strong in aircraft, there would be little chance of putting up a successful resistance, for the guns and their crews would then be exposed to heavy bombing, and with only 2,000 men, all told, there was no margin for severe casualties. Early on March 20th, 100 mines taken out of the Beaufort were laid across the entrance to Port Apra by the destroyer Rizal. It was intended to sow other mines off Tarofofo and Tumun Bay, but before this could be done the attack had developed. It was heralded by 4 Japanese planes which approached from the northwest at 11 a.m. on the 20th and flew over the island at a height of 6,000 feet. Expecting a visitation of this kind, Captain Harper had camouflaged all his big guns with tarpaulins and tree branches, which made it impossible to detect them from the air. Striking the island at Urano Point in the north, the enemy planes flew southward along the coast, passing over Agafia at a very low altitude. Here they dropped several bombs, which destroyed many of the ramshackle native houses and caused some casualties among the civilian inhabitants. Unaware of the existence of anti-aircraft guns, for Japanese spies had correctly reported that no weapons of this kind were in Guam just before the war, The planes now came down as low as 2,000 feet to make a close inspection of the batteries at Ypres. The chance was too good to be missed. 6 of the newly landed sky guns were at Ypres, and at the word of command they came smartly into action. Despite the inexperience of the gunners in this sort of work, the shooting was very accurate. 2 of the enemy planes were brought down almost immediately, and a third was disabled and had to descend on the sea. Only 1 machine escaped injury. At 11:30 a.m., the lookout station on Alatum reported masses of smoke in the northwest. Captain Harper immediately sent up one of his few planes, as it was essential to gain intelligence of the enemy's strength and course at the earliest moment possible. But the pilot of the machine was ordered to keep out of range of attack and not to get into a fight with hostile planes unless absolutely forced to do so. His report, which came in by radiophone, was to this effect: enemy fleet now steering almost due east. There are 4 armored cruisers, 4 scouts, about 16 destroyers, and what appears to be a plane carrier. Also 15 steamships, which are probably transports. Scouts are ahead, cruisers next, and destroyers forming screen round them and transports, and being fired at by anti-aircraft guns and chased by planes. The air scout was now recalled, and in a few minutes was seen making for Ypres at low elevation, with 4 enemy planes in hot pursuit. He was obviously trying to draw them over the anti-aircraft battery, and succeeded so well that 2 of the pursuers were brought down before they were aware of the danger. The other 2, being well in the rear, turned tail and got away before the ground gunners found their range. At this time, 12:15 p.m., the enemy fleet was in sight from Mount Aludum. It was seen to have split into 2 sections, one of which was steering northeast, apparently intending to round Point Retidian and come down the eastern side of the island, while the other was heading due south on a course that indicated some point on the west coast as its objective. There was no longer any doubt that landings were to be attempted simultaneously on both coasts, and it only remained to discover at which points. At 1:20 p.m., 2 of the armored cruisers, identified as the Tokiwa and Asama, stood in towards Ypres and opened a heavy fire on the harbor and the batteries. In both these ships, as became known later, the forward 8-inch turret had been replaced by a pair of 12-inch howitzers behind armored shields. The fire of the cruisers was controlled by Japanese spotting planes. These flew at too great a height to be effectively engaged by the American anti-aircraft guns. Moreover, if the latter had revealed their position by opening fire, they would at once have become the target of the heavy guns of the fleet, and must soon have been destroyed. The batteries at Orote Point and Sume came in for a severe shelling, but amidst a tempest of bursting projectiles, the handful of Marines continued to work their guns with such effect that several hits were scored on the 2 Japanese cruisers, and the Tokiwa, with her howitzers disabled by a shell bursting fairly between them, was compelled to haul out of range. In less than 20 minutes, however, both batteries were silenced. 3 out of the 4 guns had been dismounted, and the men who had fought them so gallantly lay dead or wounded. The 3rd battery, that above Atantano, was of more recent construction, and its site was evidently not known to the enemy so precisely as the other 2, for it survived the bombardment for another half-hour until a chance shell touched off some spare ammunition, causing an explosion that laid low most of the personnel. All this time, the Marines in charge of the heavy mobile guns had been chafing to support their comrades, but Captain Harper's orders were peremptory. Not a shot was to be fired until he gave the word. At his camouflaged observation post on Mount Tinkio, he received word that the 2nd detachment of Japanese ships was steaming past Taguan Point on a course parallel with the coast. A few minutes later came news that the armored cruisers Kasuga and Nishin were bombarding Port Terrafofo with 10-inch and 8-inch shells. This intelligence confirmed him in his belief that the landings were timed to take place concurrently at Ypres and Terrafofo. But so long as the Japanese aircraft were overhead, it was impossible to move a single gun without exposing it to almost instant destruction, either by bombs from the enemy planes or by the fire of the ships. Command of the air was absolutely essential to the execution of the governor's scheme of defense. And how to obtain this was a problem which had been occupying his mind from the first appearance of the invading force. So far as he could see, there was but one airplane carrier with the Japanese fleet, which ship, the Matsushima, was in clear view as she cruised some 12 miles off Apra, with an escort of 3 destroyers. If she could be sunk, or even badly damaged, her planes would be rendered homeless and must soon withdraw from action, either to descend on the sea to be picked up by other ships, or if their fuel lasted out to fly to Saipan, the nearest friendly territory. It was therefore worthwhile taking a big risk to deal with the Matsushima, and having reached this conclusion, Captain Harper ordered his 8 planes to attack her. 4 of these machines were scouts or fighters. The remaining 4 were medium bombers, each able to carry 2 600-pounder bombs. Hitherto, they had been held in reserve at Dededo, in the northern part of the island, an improvised aerodrome whose position was partly camouflaged by farm buildings. On receiving the governor's orders, all 8 machines started on what the pilots and observers well knew to be a forlorn hope. Their instructions were to ignore everything but the Matsushima. The fighting planes were, if necessary, to sacrifice themselves in order to give the bombers a safe passage to the objective. Just before the engine started up, Lieutenant J, commanding the squadron, received a personal message from the governor. "If you sink the airplane carrier, we may save Guam. Everything depends on how your attack pans out. Go to it, and good luck." The 8 machines had not climbed 2,000 feet before they were observed by Japanese planes, which at once started in pursuit. But the Americans had a good start, and their pursuers, not knowing what the objective was, lost time in following directly after them, instead of heading out to sea to intercept them before they could reach the aircraft carrier. This ship was quickly identified by her curious build, with a single funnel placed over on the starboard side and her decks alive with planes. As the American machines hove in sight, 2 or 3 planes rose from the deck to engage them, thus masking the fire of the ship's own guns, which did not come into action until it was too late. Flying well ahead of the bombers, the first 2 American fighters poured a stream of machine gun bullets into a Japanese machine that rose to meet them and sent it down out of control. A second enemy was accounted for in the same way, and then the bombing planes were on the target. The broad deck of the Matsushima offered a splendid mark, into which the opening salvo of bombs crashed with unerring aim, dropped as they were at the point-blank range of 500 feet. So violent was the explosion that one of the American bombing machines, caught in the blast, was capsized, and before the pilot could regain control, it fell headlong into the sea. The 2 remaining bombers were at this moment being fired on by Japanese pursuit planes, and their aim was therefore less accurate, but 2 more 600-pound bombs struck the deck, and a third, hitting the hull of the ship obliquely, detonated exactly on the waterline, where it blew an enormous hole in the side. To the anxious watchers on shore, it soon became evident that the audacious attack had succeeded, for the Matsushima, vomiting fire and smoke, gradually assumed a heavy list, and as the heel increased, more than one airplane was seen to slide from her deck into the water. She had stopped dead shortly after the first explosions. A large bomb had disabled her engines, and others, passing clean through the flying deck, had exploded with frightful effect in the lower compartments of the ship. It is probable that other severe leaks had been started, in addition to the great hole torn betwixt wind and water, since this alone would hardly have caused the vessel to founder, as she did in 10 minutes. Due to the confusion into which the enemy was thrown by this sudden blow, 4 of the American machines made good their escape and returned to the aerodrome at Dededo, practically undamaged, but the other 4 had paid the price of a great achievement, and they and their gallant occupants were now lying fathoms deep in the Pacific. The 4 survivors, 3 of which were fighting planes, remained on the ground only long enough to take in fresh ammunition, and were then up again with orders to drive off the Japanese spotting planes. At 3 o'clock, the one surviving enemy machine was heading north, apparently for Saipan, pursued by bursting shell from the anti-aircraft guns at Agana, while the wreckage of the last American plane lay smoldering on Mount Barrigada. The Guam Air Force had ceased to exist, but it had not sacrificed itself in vain. That the Japanese failed to appreciate the significance of the desperate attack on their aircraft carrier was demonstrated by their subsequent procedure. Looking at the matter in the light of after knowledge, it may seem strange that they did not suspect that the defenders of the island had another card which could only be played when the factor of air observation had been eliminated. On the other hand, it has to be remembered that their knowledge of the defenses was based on reports which had been compiled by spies shortly before the outbreak of war. They could not possibly have known of the subsequent arrival of the two transports and the landing of so many pieces of heavy mobile artillery. At 3:15 p.m., the warships off Apra having now ceased fire, several destroyers stood in towards the harbor, cutting a path through the minefield with their paravane sweeps. They offered an excellent mark as they moved at low speed, threading their way through the reefs and shoals at the entrance, but not a shot was fired at them. The Lamberton and the Rizal were at this time lying near Santa Cruz Island, but both were on their beam ends, their decks were deserted, and to the enemy it must have seemed that these vessels had either been wrecked by the bombardment or scuttled by their crews. Encouraged by the absolute silence prevailing ashore, which was doubtless taken as proof that the last semblance of opposition had been crushed, 9 transports now began to move in, their decks crowded with troops, their boats slung outboard, and destroyers going alongside to assist in the disembarkation. 8 miles out at sea lay the armored cruiser Kasuga, while the Tokiwa and Asama were much closer inshore. The transports did not actually enter the harbor, but they approached to within a mile of the Catalan bank before heaving to. Then the first contingent of troops went over the side and entered the boats, which made for the harbor in tow of the motor pinnaces and destroyers. The disembarkation was well underway, and the first boatloads were within less than half a mile of the shore before Captain Harper played his trump card. Suddenly there came the dull boom of a great gun from among the hills behind Apra, followed an instant later by regular salvos from other guns, so well placed as to be invisible from the sea. The first shell pitched into the water just ahead of the leading transport, which lay broadside onto the shore, offering an easy target to skilled gunners at a range of barely 4 miles. Heavy explosions were now observed on board this ship and her consorts as the 7-inch projectiles got home. The field guns on the island had also come into action, spraying the crowded boats with shrapnel and blowing a good half of them to matchwood in the first few minutes. 3 of the transports were ablaze, and others had suffered severely before the Japanese recovered from their surprise. Then their destroyers gallantly steamed in to shield the remaining boats, firing heavily but blindly at the hidden batteries ashore, and the large warships further out reopened with every gun that would bear. But not for a moment did the hail of projectiles cease to scourge the transports, which had now been transformed into slaughter pens. 3 of them, all badly damaged, succeeded in withdrawing from effective range, but the remaining 6 were in a hopeless plight. One sank as a destroyer was towing her out, and shortly afterwards the destroyer herself lay helpless on the water with her engines wrecked by a shell. The armored cruiser Tokiwa was so badly hit that she steamed out of action. The Asama had her forward funnel blown over the side, and a few hits were even made on the Kasuga. By 4:30 p.m., the landing attempt at Apra had been utterly defeated. What remained of the enemy's ships had hauled out of range, and boats from the Lamberton and Rizal were outside the harbor, picking up a few half-drowned Japanese soldiers. The carnage on board the transports and in the boats had been frightful. Not less than 5,000 men had perished, and each of the ships still afloat had the greater part of its contingent disabled by wounds. At Port Tarofofo, on the other side of the island, events had meanwhile been taking much the same course, though at this point the American artillery was less numerous and only 3 transports were actually sunk, the others making good their escape in a more or less damaged condition. But it was here that the Japanese Navy suffered its first serious loss. The armored cruiser Nishin, having incautiously approached to within 3 miles of the shore before the American guns were unmasked, came under so tremendous a fire that she was disabled in 5 minutes, and before the destroyers which came rushing to her assistance could pass a towing hawser, she blew up and sank. At Tarofofo, as at Ypres, the Japanese warships had reopened fire with all guns as soon as the cannonade from the island began. At both places, clouds of brown smoke rising from the woods and hills seemed to denote the presence of American guns, and these positions were accordingly swept with projectiles of every caliber. And yet not a single gun was touched, nor were there more than a dozen casualties among the American gun crews. The smoke which had drawn the enemy's fire came, not from the guns, but from small charges of a smoke-producing compound, which were touched off periodically at various points well away from the batteries, each burst of smoke being timed to coincide with a discharge from the guns. By this means the Japanese observers were completely deceived, and their ships expended an enormous quantity of shell with practically no result. Both sections of the invading fleet were well out to sea before darkness fell, and it looked as if the attack had been definitely abandoned. But the garrison stood to its guns throughout the night, for there was a bare possibility that the Japanese would try to land on some other part of the coast under cover of darkness. But when the sun rose on the 21st, the sea was empty of ships. Only a faint haze on the northwest horizon marked the whereabouts of the discomfited enemy, who was, in fact, returning to Formosa at the best speed of which his sorely damaged remaining transports were capable. Guam was safe, for the time being, but its elated defenders well knew that a fresh attack, this time in overpowering force, was merely a question of days. Nor was there any real foundation for the hope, which a few of them cherished, that the United States fleet would arrive from the east before the next Japanese assault took place. Since the island had no longer any means of communicating with the outer world, the American naval authorities necessarily remained ignorant of the situation at Guam, though they assumed it to be already in Japanese possession. In fact, the Tokyo Wireless Bulletin of March 20th had announced, somewhat prematurely as it turned out, that the fortress of Guam has fallen to a combined attack by the Imperial military and naval forces. Captain Harper employed the respite which had been granted him by marking out new gun positions, building emplacements and trenches, and improving the roads over which the tractor batteries were likely to pass. He knew, however, that there was not the least hope of repeating his former success. This time the enemy would come well provided with aircraft, and these would infallibly locate the position of the guns as soon as they opened fire. On March 22nd, 5 American submarines reached Ypres, 3 more coming in the next day. Unfortunately, most of them had expended all their torpedoes, and there were none of these weapons in reserve at Guam. As submarines without torpedoes were useless for defense purposes, Captain Harper ordered 6 of the boats, after replenishing their oil tanks, to proceed to Honolulu, together with the destroyers Lamberton and Rizal and the transport Newport News. Only 2 submarines, S-23 and S-50, were retained at Guam. Damage to her machinery caused by a stray shell in the first attack prevented the Beaufort from sailing. It may be mentioned here that all the other vessels made the voyage to Honolulu without mishap. Not until April 3rd did the second Japanese attack develop. At an early hour that morning, enemy aircraft appeared over the island in great strength, and soon afterwards, a squadron of transports and naval vessels, including 6 battleships and cruisers, was seen approaching. Profiting by the severe lesson they had had on the previous occasion, the Japanese now adopted different tactics. No preparatory bombardment took place, but 4 of the transports headed towards the harbor with the apparent intention of coming right inside to land their troops on the beach at Sume. To counter this bold stroke, it was absolutely necessary for the defenders to open fire, reluctant as they were to reveal the position of their guns while enemy airplanes were swarming overhead. But any further delay would enable the invaders to gain a foothold ashore, and that would be the beginning of the end. So Captain Harper passed word to the hidden guns, which at once came into action against the transports. But scarcely had the first flashes betrayed the battery positions when a dozen Japanese planes came swooping down, regardless of anti-aircraft fire, to drop their bombs with deadly aim. A few minutes later, the warships lying off the island opened a terrific bombardment with gas and high explosive shell, the whereabouts of the American batteries having been reported to them by the airmen. It was no longer a case of blindfold shooting. Thanks to the spotting aircraft, almost every salvo took effect on or near the batteries, and in a very short time, half the guns had been silenced. Being without gas masks, the men were completely exposed to the fumes from asphyxiating shell. In more than one battery, the entire personnel was hors de combat. In others, guns and men had been destroyed by the big, high-explosive projectiles. More Japanese transports now headed for the harbor, to be received this time with a desultory fire that did little harm to them, though it drew upon the defenders another annihilating blast of steel and gas from the Japanese squadron. At 11:30 a.m., the troops from the leading transports entered their boats and were towed inshore. By noon, several thousand men had been landed and were steadily advancing over the densely wooded heights of Orote toward Ypres. The landing had been effected with small loss, for practically all the American guns on the western side of the island had been silenced, and only a few hundred members of the garrison had escaped injury. Here and there, a handful of Marines stood their ground and opened fire with machine guns as soon as the Japanese troops became visible. But whenever this happened, an airplane dived down and released a gas bomb which either disabled the defenders or forced them to retreat. When it appeared certain that no landing would be attempted on the east coast, Captain Harper had ordered the 7-inch guns in the hills near Terrafofo to reinforce the western batteries. But no sooner had they left their camouflaged positions than they were attacked by aircraft, and eventually by ship fire as well. Not one of these guns got within reach of Ypres. In some cases, the tractor was damaged by a bomb or shell, making it impossible to drag the gun any further. In others, the entire crew of tractor and gun were killed. Seeing that further progress was impossible, the officer in command, Lieutenant Oliver, resolved to destroy the guns lest they should fall intact into enemy hands, and this task was successfully performed, in spite of the Japanese airmen who planed down to machine gun the demolition party. At dusk on April 3rd, the entire southern half of the island was occupied by enemy troops. The remnant of the garrison had retreated to the north, but their position was hopeless. Only by keeping to the shelter of the woods were they able to escape the bombs and bullets of the ubiquitous Japanese planes. That night, Captain Harper held a council of war with his 3 surviving officers. Further effective resistance was impossible, and repugnant as was the thought of surrender, it was the only alternative to a useless sacrifice of the remaining men who had fought so gallantly against tremendous odds. In the morning, therefore, the little party, not more than 100 all told, came into the open and laid down their arms in full sight of the first Japanese airplane that appeared. Observing what had happened, this machine at once turned and flew back to headquarters. 2 hours later, a company of Japanese infantry reached the spot and escorted the captives to Agafia, where General Awakara, in command of the invading force, had already established himself in the governor's residence. He received Captain Harper with marked courtesy, congratulating him on his gallant defense and assuring him that his men would be well treated. Fate, however, had willed that Captain Harper's captivity should be of short duration. On April 6th, he and 2 other officers were sent on board the destroyer Hagi, which was to convey them to Japan. This vessel had not proceeded 20 miles on her voyage before she was struck by a torpedo from the American submarine S-50, which caused her to founder in a few minutes. While her victim was in the act of sinking, S-50 rose to the surface a short distance away, whereupon Captain Harper swam to within hailing distance and announced his identity. He was promptly picked up, together with Lieutenant Schreiner, but although a lengthy search was made, the 3rd American officer could not be found, having evidently met his death in the water. As Japanese aircraft were then approaching the scene, the S-50 had to dive. This submarine remained in the vicinity of Guam for some days longer, hoping to catch one of the larger Japanese warships. No opportunity presented itself, however, and as fuel was running low, the S-50 eventually made her way to Honolulu. Her consort, the S-23, did not reach that place, nor was she ever heard of again. And since the enemy made no claim to have sunk her, it was surmised that she had been lost either by some accident or through striking a mine off one of the neighboring Japanese islands.
This concludes today's reading of The Great Pacific War by Hector Bywater, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also tomorrow for the next chapter, or download the complete audiobook from our webshop at www.payhip.com/Antonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.